After decades of government-promoted abortion, it turns out that nations are now beginning to incentivize parenthood because they've discovered that they need more babies. Talk about the law of unintended consequences. This summer, the city of Tokyo has introduced a new dating app. It's not designed to facilitate a hookup culture or to accommodate singles looking for something to do on Friday night. It's designed for people who commit to being serious about marriage because the city understands that their fertility rate has dropped to 0.99 children per family. In other words, the replacement rate for a culture to have children to sustain its population and to continue to advance, the break-even point is 2.1 children per couple. Tokyo is less than 1 child per couple, and they've come to understand that their city cannot survive. They have no future if they don't get babies. So their strategy is to try and join other groups other nations who are now going to great lengths to try and improve their plummeting birth rates. During the 1950s, women had about 5 children on average globally, but most countries, including the United States, are now having serious problems with what researchers call the replacement rate. That's the number of children that a couple needs to have in order to keep the population number steady. That's the 2.1 children per family. According to research published recently in The Lancet, birth rates along their current trajectory will continue to fall until by the year 2100, only 3% of the nations of the world will have sufficient births to sustain their culture. Last year, as the lowest nation on the planet, South Korea reported a birth rate of 0.72 per couple. Their response is to start what is in typical Korean language. They've created the Ministry of Low Birth Rate Counter Planning. In other words, a government agency to try and develop ways to incentivize parenthood because they understand that without children, there is no future. European nations are doing a variety of things to try and address this problem. Recently, French President Emmanuel Macron announced free fertility checks for women 25 years old and older. In other words, they will pay the fee to check and make sure that there are no hindrances to you having babies. My favorite incentive is in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared just last year that women under 30 who have at least 1 child will now be exempt from paying income tax for life. That's how serious this is. You know, a government is panicked about their population rate when they're willing to give you a tax exemption for life if you will just do the most basic function of marriage and have children. Where did this start? Well, historians tell us that it goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th century, as men began to leave the farm and move to the cities to work in factories, as culture became more mechanized, what happened was that the economic incentive for having large families began to decline. In other words, when you owned and operated a farm, children were a part of your workforce. So a lot of children worked to your advantage because there was always work to be done and you needed the help. As men began to live by straight paychecks from hourly jobs in factories, all of a sudden the economic benefits of large families began to fall away. Now, another blow to this decline in birth rates came in the 1960s when contraceptives began to have some major advances and became more culturally acceptable. Today, people often talk about the expense of having children, But often they're really speaking about a deeper reality, which is that our culture now views children as a burden and speak about having babies in terms of the opportunity costs to a mother for the way that she uses her time. It's interesting. Timothy Carney has written a book called Family Unfriendly, and he says the real problem, more than those economic issues, is what he calls civilizational sadness. In other words, as developed countries have become more secular, like the United States, he says people have generally lost a sense of hope for humanity's purpose, and with no real sense of making a contribution to a better future, he said this attitude takes away a lot of the incentive to raise up future generations. In fact, even when I was a child, you often heard about people who worked hard because they wanted to give their children a better life. That was a common motivation for parenting. And yet today, you often hear people talk about the expectation that no matter what they do, their children will not have a better life. They will not have a better world. In fact, I hear people more than ever before talk about the moral qualms they have about, quote, bringing a child into this world. Well, the reality here is if we want to see the population rate rebound to the place where humanity again has a future, we don't need to just change the economic aspects of parenting. We need to change this mindset, this culture that says children are a burden. They are a significant weight that have to be borne by parents. The Biden administration, as it always does, misses the point of the problem when it tries to solve the American birth crisis in typical liberal fashion. The Biden administration recently announced an expansion to daycare subsidies, a plan that would affect approximately 100,000 children. The problem with that approach is, what they don't understand is they want to incentivize women to have babies, but to make it possible for them to have babies and yet stay in the workforce. Because the liberal attitude towards the family is still the idea that children are sort of a necessary evil for the survival of humanity, but there's no real admission, there's no culture change that says raising children is the most significant contribution that you can make to the advancement of the human race. I saw a meme recently where a feminist looking down on a mother with obvious disdain made the remark that she had forfeited the obligation for parenthood, for motherhood, and she said instead, "I am a scientist." To which the mother, who she was obviously looking down her nose at, the mother said, "Well, I'm a stay-at-home mom, but I've raised 5 scientists." You see, until we change the cultural mindset that says children are a hindrance, they're a burden, until we recapture the biblical attitude that a family is our highest priority, raising children and producing productive adults that change the world in their generation, until we recapture this biblical mandate to be fruitful and multiply, this problem is not going away. And if the Lord doesn't come back, what the numbers tell us is that in a mere 70 years, we're talking about the human race being in danger of self-extinction. Listen to these Bible verses. Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. The psalmist says, "Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate." Now, I particularly love this verse in Proverbs chapter 17, verse 6, because this verse not only recognizes the blessing that children are to a family, but it extends that blessing to other generations. I love this verse. Proverbs 17:6 says, "Grandchildren are the crown of the old." In other words, When you get to the end of your days, the time spent in your office will not be on your mind. The time spent accomplishing the things that the world says are important will not be the focus of your attention. What is the crown of the elderly? Grandchildren. It is the multiple generations that have flowed out of their commitment to live by God's charge to be fruitful and multiply. Well, how did we get to this problem? I mean, we talked about the Industrial Revolution and contraception and those kinds of things. But part of this problem is that we've lost a biblical sense of what the point of humanity is in the beginning. We are part, in America at least, of a secular society. In fact, what was once a Judeo-Christian worldview that undergirded everything that we did in this nation, both in the United States and particularly in Western Europe, that Judeo-Christian worldview has been replaced by a purely humanistic or secular worldview. And the problem with the secular worldview, and frankly that is seen unfolding in the increase over recent years of those who self-identify as either atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated, non-affiliated with any religious body of believers. As those numbers have increased in recent years, the number of non-religious Americans, polls tell us, between 2008 and 2013 rose by 9%. But from 2013 to 2019, it rose by 30%. And then after 2019 to 35%. In other words, the secularization of our culture has been on a rapid increase for recent years. Now, I don't know whether it's the pandemic or whether there is a movement of the Spirit of God in churches, but it's interesting that while that number over the last few years has remained plateaued or pretty steady, the latest research tells us that those numbers are beginning to go in a different direction. For example, the most recent research says that among baby boomers, that is, those approaching the retirement age, the rise in non-religious activity continues to go up. But among Generation X, it remained steady. And among millennials and Generation Z, our younger generations, there has been a significant decline in those who say that they have no affiliation or interest in religion. In other words, the younger you go in America right now, the more interest and serious consideration of faith issues you begin to see. It's popular among curmudgeons like most baby boomers to look at the following generations and say, man, we're in real trouble if they're going to be in charge. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to spiritual vitality, Generation Z and millennials are beginning to display a vibrancy of faith that boomers have lost over the last generation. We worry about the future, but I'm telling you, the future is to be found in those generations as they begin to gravitate back to a biblical approach to family and culture. History shows that God often moves most powerfully when a culture is at its deepest decline. I think we qualify for a moment in time when God may move among the youngest among us and save our nation and, frankly, save humanity, so that the end of the story will unfold precisely as God has always intended it. We've discovered that secularism is a spiritual dead end. God has wired into the human heart a yearning for purpose, and when secularism steals that purpose, it creates a culture that is not interested in the future, that has lost sight of the significance of family, and has no real motivation to work hard to advance for anything. I mean, if nothing matters, then what's the point? But see, the biblical witness is things do matter because God has a plan and He created us on purpose to accomplish something incredible. To a hopeless world, The message of the cross is the power of God for salvation. That's what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. But while God's people may be concerned about where we are right now as a culture, we are never to fall into cynicism or despair, because God has called us to communicate the good news of the gospel to a confused world. We definitely live in a confused world, and frankly, we have to be the kind of people who refuse to allow secularism to have the last word. Christ, he tells us in John chapter 16, Christ has overcome the world. And because of that, no matter who's elected president, no matter what trends are popular, no matter how secularism tries to steal the joy of life, we have something the world needs, and we need to live life putting that joy on display. So, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, let me tell you something. Go out and have some babies. Why? Because secularism steals the joy of life, and eventually we will see the influence of the Judeo-Christian worldview reemerge, if for no other reason than because our opponents will numerically decline while Christians should numerically increase and train up succeeding generations to live for Jesus Christ. How can you be a culture warrior today? Have children. Have grandchildren. Because children are a blessing to their families, and they are the crown of their grandparents. Let's go live that life and put optimism and hope on display in a world that has lost any reason to do anything. This is Truth Currents.